Welcome back for the second part of One Man's Faith tonight. Let's go ahead and take our Bibles now and let's go back to our series. We've been looking at covenant, especially blood covenant. And let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18. And let's look at some things that are going on here. Now, we've talked about covenant and the fact that covenants can be made between individuals or between tribes or a group of people. And when a whole tribe or a group of people are involved, the whole tribe or group of people don't come together at the, in the middle, and all of them have to walk through and say all these things and do the cutting and all that. No, they send a representative. They send a representative for the whole tribe. And if you'll remember, there were certain specific things that had to happen when they got together. They exchanged robes. They exchanged their weapons. I forgot what some of the other things were they did. They cut themselves and did kind of a blood brother ceremony, mixing the blood, saying, "My blood is your blood is my blood," and so we're, so we are one. They exchanged names. They swore that, hey, if I don't do this, then this is the curse that'll be upon me, and if you don't, this will be the curse upon you, and these will be the blessings of the two of us coming together. All these things were part of the covenant relationship. And if it involved a lot of people, then representatives came to the ceremony, and each represented their tribe or their people. Okay, now let's look here. This is the story of Jonathan and David. Now, if you remember, David was taken in and became, lack of a better word, an employee of Saul's. He would play the harp, and he would soothe Saul, these kind of things. And somewhere in this mix, Jonathan and David became really, 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 really good friends. And so in chapter 18 here it says, "And it came about that when he had finished speaking to Saul, when David had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Saul was knit together with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as he loved himself." They became brothers. They became really close friends. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Talking about David. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David. And look what he does. Because he loved him as himself, and Jonathan stripped himself of his robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword, his bow, and his belt. See, that's part of that covenantal exchange. We just talked about that. They would exchange robes. They would exchange their armor, their belts and things to say, hey, my sword is your sword is my sword. My identity by giving you my robe. You see, he was the king's son, okay? And he was saying, listen, I'm giving what I am to you. I'm giving what I am to you. Not only am I giving you my royalty, David, but here's my armor. I will fight for you. And I believe David was doing the same thing. It just talks here. And so it says, so David went out wherever Saul sent him, and David prospered. And Saul sent him over to the men of war, or placed him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also the sight of David's servants. And it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing and meeting King Saul with tambourines and joy and with musical instruments. And the woman sang as they played, "Saul has slain his thousands." And he probably really loved that. But then they add this other line, and David his 10,000s. Whoa! Wrong thing to say in front of the king. You don't want to lift up David and say Saul's only done 1,000 and David's done 10, or Saul's only done 1,000, but David's done 10,000. And it says, and Saul, verse 8, became angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they've only ascribed 1,000. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? What, is that what he wants now? He wants my kingdom? You see, Saul's heart was changing. It already started because God has already disowned Saul. Saul was supposed to have waited for Samuel before making a certain sacrifice. Matter of fact, Saul wasn't supposed to make it at all. He was supposed to wait for the priest and the prophet Samuel to come, and Samuel would make it, and everything would have been made right, and King Saul would have been anointed and really become the king. But now, God said, listen, he doesn't want to do, he's not going to follow after me. This is not going to be my man anymore. And God kind of just let him go. And so God said, Samuel, I want you to go to the house of Jesse. There's a man there that I want to become king because he has my heart. And if you remember, Samuel went to Jesse and said, hey, God told me to come and anoint one of your kids because one of them is going to be the king. Man, you know, that probably really excited Jesse. And so Jesse brought in his oldest. God said, nope. He brought in his next. God said, nope. Third, nope. Fourth, nope. Fifth, nope. Sixth, nope. And Samuel said, do you have any others? I mean, God's rejected these 6. And Jesse said, well, there's the youngest, but he's out attending the sheep. He's nothing. Well, if you look back into it, there's a possibility that David was an illegitimate child. The Bible even says he was ruddy, which means he was reddish in color. He was different from his other. And David kind of alludes to that, I think, in Psalm 51. But Samuel said, listen, run and get him. Let's see what happens. And so Jesse sent for David. David was the youngest one. He was probably 15 or 16. He comes in and God said, that's the one. And so Samuel anoints him to be king. Now that doesn't mean he is king. He has to go through a long process before he actually becomes king. David had slain 10,000, Saul only slew 1,000, and he became angry. He says, what? They're singing songs about him. Does he want the kingdom too? And so Saul got kind of watched David. And it says an evil spirit came upon him. It says in verse 9, Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. And it came about on the next day that an evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand, and a spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I'll pin David to the wall. But it says, but David escaped from his presence twice. That's interesting, isn't it? He threw it once. David said, well, maybe because of this ranting and all that he's doing, he just doesn't know what he's doing. But then he threw his spear again. So it said David escaped. And David was afraid of Saul, verse 12. For the Lord was with David, but had departed from Saul. an evil spirit. He picks up that sword or that spear and he throws it twice. Saul started off being obedient to God. He started off doing what God said, but then he turned away. His heart turned. His heart turned. He wasn't totally right about who God was and his following God. And so he turned, and God started looking for this other man. And he found this young man who looked toward God. And we've talked a little bit about this in the past before, that whatever David did, he sought God first. He sought God first. So David had a heart for God. He was totally the opposite of Saul. Saul's heart fell from God. And he started to try to do things on his own. On his own. And it didn't work. And we see here in chapter 18 that Saul's gone off on the deep end about David, but David and Jonathan have this covenant. And Jonathan several times protects David. In essence, he's got to, because they're in covenant. Because the only way to break a covenant is death. Or the only way the covenant will cease. Yes, you can break it, but by breaking it, you're bringing a curse upon yourself. And so we don't go around breaking covenants. But Jonathan and David loved each other as brothers and made a covenant. Okay, let's take a break, get that second cup of coffee, and I'll be right back.